Hi, this is Michael Dermer. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about setting behaviors that are not acceptable. You know, in the early stages of a business, it's largely chaos. And if you don't set some behaviors that are just off limits, it can really undermine the culture of your organization. So what does it mean to set behaviors that are not acceptable? You know, when you're running an entrepreneurial venture, you have so many different things on your plate. Everything from customers to raising money to your internal operations to technology. As we all know, the list is endless. But along the way, what makes your organization hum is people. So you really have to set some general parameters for your organization. So even though there is the chaos of an entrepreneurial venture, you have to set some ground rules of some behaviors that are just not acceptable. So here's a couple of them. First is speaking negatively about customers, right? In an entrepreneurial venture, you're actually trying to create a product and service that might be considered new. So almost by definition, that product or service is not going to fit perfectly with your customer. They might want it to be a little bit more red or a little bit more blue. They're most likely you're going to say it's too expensive, right? They're going to say perhaps you're not delivering enough value. When you allow yourself as an organization to speak negatively about customers, it does several damaging things. First and foremost, it sends a message to your team, whoever that team may be, right? That message is, it's perfectly fine to blame customers. What that means is we're not actually going to take the hard look we need to take at ourselves. How do we improve our product and service, right? How do we challenge ourselves to do better? As soon as we create that culture that it's okay to blame customers, you will find that people will do it over and over and over again, as opposed to taking a hard look at ourselves to improve our product or service. Okay? So the first thing we want to avoid is speaking negatively about customers. Next is speaking negatively about employees, right? In an early stage venture, it is rare that all the employees in the company are perfect for the company. Right? Some of them are not going to have all the skills that they need. Some of them are going to be a little bit underqualified for what you need them to do. But at the end of the day, especially when you're leading the company, you cannot ever set the tone that you speak negatively about employees. Think about it. You may have an employee that decides to leave the company. And you as the leader say something like, well, we're better off now that they've left. The first thing that all the other people around the table think is, well, I wonder if they're saying that about me. Okay? Even if there's people that actually deserve to lose their jobs, right? They haven't performed, they've underachieved. When you as the leader speak negatively about employees, even if the person has not performed, it really sets the tone of your organization for all the other people around the table. Okay? So regardless of the circumstances, never speak negatively about your employees. Next is believing that you don't have competition. I would argue that every single business on the planet these days has competition. You don't just have competition from across the street, you have competition from across the globe. And organizations that don't recognize that they can get competition from anywhere really are setting themselves up for failure, right? On the other hand, organizations that acknowledge that not only do they have competition today, but they could have new competitors tomorrow, and then sit down and lay out the strategies and the tactics to overcome that competition, those are the organizations that really thrive. So never allow your organization to develop the behavior or the mindset that you don't have competition. Next is dismissing how your team feels. You know, a lot of times in an entrepreneurial venture, we think it's just accepted that everybody is going to work their butts off. They're probably going to do it for below market salaries. And as long as they're aligned to the vision of where we're going, everything's going to be fine. Well, you as the leader have to be smart enough to understand that if your team is expressing frustration about the way things are working, and you dismiss that as, hey, this is just part of the deal of being in a startup, for example, you really run the risk of alienating your team and setting your company back a long ways. Don't ever dismiss how your team feels. Address these issues and concerns with your team. You may not always be able to solve them, but make sure they understand what your thought process is and never dismiss how your team feels. Next is basic behaviors that you exhibit every day. This is everything from yelling, cutting your team off, not listening in meetings, and being late all the time, right? Remember, we understand that you're in the midst of this crazy entrepreneurial venture and you have a ton of things to do, right? But treat people with respect, right? If you're on time, you show that you respect their time as much as yours. They'll go the extra mile for you, right? Don't cut people off in the meeting. I know you already know the answer. And don't get me wrong, this is an incredibly hard thing to do, but this is one of the behaviors you have to try to avoid. Another one is making exceptions for you as the CEO, right? If there is a rule that applies to everybody in the organization, and now you as CEO aren't subject to that rule, that sends a really damaging message to your entire company. It means that the rules apply to everybody else but you. So really make sure that if you put something in place, you raise your hand as being the first one that's subject to it. If you're the first one that curses, put $5 in fact, put $10 in the jar. Because that way people understand that if CEO is going to do it, everybody's going to do it. And finally, and this is always a hard one, no romantic relationships with company people. Listen, when we're entrepreneurs, the 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 people that we're hanging out with at work, we might be spending 20 hours a day with these people. It is very natural to develop personal relationships. In fact, it's good in a lot of ways that we develop the closeness and trust to get us through the entrepreneurial venture. That being said, you have to avoid romantic relationships with people that work in your company. When you're starting your own company or running your own company, there's already a ton of emotion involved. There's already this whole notion that you're investing something for the future, you're passionate about it. It's a very visceral, emotional experience. It already becomes difficult to define roles and responsibilities and accountability. Think about 2 founders, 2 co-founders who were friends, and they went to business school together. And now they've got to start to hold each other accountable. That's already complicated enough. Imagine introducing a romantic relationship into the middle of that. It just doesn't work. So all of these things together all come from the context of what's it like to be an entrepreneur. And when you think about all these different behaviors that we're trying to avoid, we're trying to set the tone for what we want the company to be like to go forward. Some of these seem harmless. I mean, it seems harmless to say something about a customer, right, or to talk over somebody in a meeting, or to speak negatively about an employee. But you'll realize really quickly, if you exhibit any of these behaviors, it'll undermine your culture and your ability to make progress from day one. There's much more information on this lesson written out for you right side by side with this video, so take a look when you get a chance.